Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Yin Khvat. We're bringing you the latest news and analysis from a Taiwan perspective. Here's what's coming up.
はい、先ほど弾道ミサイルが発射されました。連日続く弾道ミサイルの発射、これは暴挙であり、決して許されるものではないと考えています。
Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida in November on the dozens of missiles, including an intercontinental ballistic missile launched by North Korea that forced Japanese residents to seek shelter. Today, we ask how these aggressions, coupled with China's threats in the East China Sea, have led to Japan's biggest defense buildup since World War II. Joining me in the studio to discuss this are Leonard Chao, National Tsinghua University Adjunct Professor and former Taiwan Ambassador to eSwatini, and Guo Yuren, Professor of the Institute of China and Asia Pacific Studies at National Sun Yat-sen University. He's also President of Taiwan Society of Japanese Studies and the Executive Director at the Institute for National Policy Research. I also speak with Gerard de Pippo, Center for Strategic and International Studies, Economics Program Senior Fellow, and he's also an ex-US National Intelligence Council Deputy National Intelligence Officer and formerly Central Intelligence Agency Senior Economic Analyst. Ambassador Chao, Professor Guo, welcome to the show. But first, China and North Korea are not the only sources of military tension for Japan. Russia's defense ministry has released this footage of a strategic bomber capable of carrying nuclear bombs and nuclear-armed cruise missiles. This was one of two that patrolled the Sea of Japan for 7 hours in mid-December. Russia and Japan have a territorial dispute over the southern Kuril Islands, or the Northern Territories as they're known in Japan, seen here, dating back 75 years ago when the then Soviet Union seized them at the end of World War II. This has kept the two countries from signing a formal peace treaty to end the war. Ambassador Chao, let me begin with you. So that is some of the geopolitical context for Japan. Now, The Economist famously named Taiwan as the most dangerous place on earth, but can we say that Japan is close?
Well, The Economist, a cover story about the most dangerous, place on Earth. I think it's rather referring to the crisis in the Taiwan Strait area, and I think as people know that the major crisis facing the Taiwan Strait area comes from China's threat, and the China's threat is rather imminent. It's imminent and very, it's very obviously, no doubt about it. But in comparison, Japan's threat actually comes from the three parts. North, Russia. I think it's a historical, about over 100 years ago, already had a Russell in the Japanese War.
And being in the middle of
the last century.
North Korea as well as
North Korea and on the east, and then so the threat meeting the so-called crisis. A possible crisis facing Japan is rather from Russia, North Korea, or from the Chinese expansion in South China, East China Sea. But it's rather conditional, not so imminent.
Right.
It's rather so it's in other words, it's manageable.
Maybe perhaps a longer term or conditional threat, as opposed to Taiwan being in an acute threat situation from China. Professor Guo, do you agree with that?
I think security tension surrounding Japan is actually higher than Taiwan. There are some.
So you're disagreeing with the ambassador here. Why is that?
There are actually some very obvious indicators. For example, when Nancy Pelosi came to Taiwan, 2nd of August, during the Chinese military drill, there were 5 Chinese missiles actually shooting into Japanese EEZ. And number 2 is this October. There were 3 North Korean missiles flying over Japanese territorial air. And also, I would like to show you this. If you look at the map here, this map is basically showing from 2019 all the way to 2020 how Chinese and Russian Air Force joined the cruising surrounding the islands of Japan. especially going through this Tsushima Strait. They were basically practicing blockade of the Tsushima Strait like every year.
Right. So you're saying that compared to what Taiwan has seen, for example, after Nancy Pelosi's visit, there was a de facto blockade that some people are saying around Taiwan, but you're saying that for Japan, it's been every year for a long time.
It's been every year. And another indicator you can see is, Japan is doing more than 1,000 times scramble every year.
And how much does that compare to Taiwan?
Taiwan has something around 300 to 400 scrambles per year.
So three times as
Three
as many,
times,
as you
yes.
said.
Yeah. And if you look at these, before Nancy Pelosi came to Taiwan, you have joint operation Chinese and Russian navies.
Right. So we can see the red movements are Chinese.
Chinese military vessels. The blue is Russian.
Right. And it's encircling the islands, in
Exactly.
fact.
And they were cruising very close to Japanese territorial ground, nearly around 3 nautical miles. But for Chinese vessels cruising around Taiwan, it was only 24 nautical miles.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So why do we not hear about this as much? Why do we not hear about the threat to Japan as much? Is it because of what Ambassador said, that this is a conditional, it's not an acute?
Well, we might need to discuss about this matter from the Chinese policymakers' perspective. I believe that they've been in the minds of the Chinese policymakers, such as specifically Xi Jinping. Well, the relations between Japan and China, I think that they just celebrated the 50th anniversary of their diplomatic relations established. So I think both China and Japan, they try somehow to kind of reach a certain rapprochement, not a quasi-rapprochement relation. I don't think either side, well, particularly China. Okay, on the surface, China looks like military, trigger happy, the belligerent action. But deep in their policies mind, policymakers' mind, they don't want to, appeal to any military, action against, against Japan. So certainly, the EEZ, the 5, ballistic missile in Okinawa, I think it's rather maybe aggressive. It's aggressive military action. I don't think that in the foreseeable future, that China, that's going to be we can foresee any tangible military action between Japan and China.
Let me bring Professor in on that. So how about some analysts have talked about China possibly taking some of the Japanese islands as a launching base in an invasion of Taiwan, perhaps the Senkaku Islands, also known here and in China as WWII, or attacking US bases, which are actually on those islands.
The possibility?
Yeah. And therefore increasing the threat to Japan from China.
That is very unrealistic if China is planning to have a direct military invasion to Taiwan without taking those U.S. bases in Okinawa into consideration. In Okinawa, they have two largest overseas bases, military bases of the states. One is Futenma, which is the Marine base. The other is Kadena, which is the biggest Air Force base overseas for the states. So if China really want to have any kind of military invasion to Taiwan without taking those two bases into consideration, is unrealistic.
Okay. If we can briefly, Ambassador, talk about Russia-Japan tensions. As we said earlier, that it was about over the Kuril Islands, also known in Japan as the Northern Territories. So why are they important? Let's start with why are they so important for both Japan and Russia?
Well, deep in the Japanese minds, they have a very painful, memory. Over 100 years ago, we know that at the beginning of last century, there's a Russo-Japanese war. It happened, in Manchuria of China and also part of the Korean, peninsula. That left, although Japan won the war, still that left some very, it's a very complex memory. And Russia, of course, historically, traditional, that remained as a northern, potential threat enemy for Japanese. So I think for the Kuril Islands, the 4 islands disputes, as I recall, when I was studying at Harvard, one of my favorite professors, who turned out to be a famous, brand name, he recreated the concept of Thucydides trap. The existing power and then the emerging power. That's for the Athens and the Spartans.
How about strategically? How about in terms of access to the Pacific? In terms of any sort of Taiwan contingency involving the U.S. in that sense? Yeah,
Japan, although not to their likings, obviously, they cannot help but to get involved in the China's possible threat, invasion to Taiwan.
But the Kuril Islands.
Yeah, Kuril Islands.
In the northern territories. Yeah. So Russia wants to hold onto this.
But it remains it's a controversial, still debatable and unsolved issue. I think the Harvard professor, Graham Allison is a very fair. He asked me, only one question. How do you like the four island disputes? The four island disputes has been lingering on for many years after the World War II. The Soviet, the occupied those four islands, and Japan and Russia are still in the process negotiating over these four islands. That remains as an issue. So I think on the surface, Japan has every reason to be beware of their the security threat. I don't think that it's going to be a very tangible, foreseeable, really a security threat facing Japan. But indirectly, not direct threat, but indirectly, they of course they feel some sense of pressure and tension from China, from North Korea. That's obviously, yeah.
Oh, okay. Now Japan has a defensive military, and to understand why, we need to go back to World War II, when Imperial Japan was the aggressor in Asia. Emperor Hirohito's representatives surrendered the war in 1945, and the US's General Douglas MacArthur imposed a groundbreaking pacifist constitution on the country in which Japan renounced war. From 1947, the country maintained only a de facto defensive army, banning offensive weapons such as long-range missiles. But in 2015, a controversial change was made to allow Japan's self-defense forces to defend allies in case of war being declared on them. So that's the background, which explains why the current defense updates are a big deal. Now, for the first time since 2013, Japan has revised 3 key defense documents in a major undertaking. And the ruling LDP has laid out a 5-year defense budget of 43 trillion yen, or about $320 billion US. Now, by 2027, the defense budget will account for 2% of Japan's GDP, making it the 3rd biggest military budget behind only China and the US. Significantly, the defense strategy agrees for Japan to acquire the capability to counter-strike, in other words, the ability to counter-attack Chinese or North Korean. Ambassador, what does it say about the mood, the consensus in Japan, where surveys say between 50% and 2/3 of the population actually backs a military buildup?
Well, they back the spirit of beefing up the military, the capability military build up. But still, I think the increase of military spending on the Japanese side, I can relate to. I have empathy. If I were a Japanese, definitely I would feel the same way. But that will be the GDP 2% increase. I think that will be that rank after only next to the China and the United States. In terms of the spirit, Japanese will be supportive and I was sympathetic to. But this idea, military spending increase, actually it comes from the Abe era. So I think a couple of years ago, the Abe, Shinzo Abe has already thought about that. However, there's certain.
But the public wasn't on board then, whereas they are now. That's the big shift.
I checked with a Japanese expert friend of mine this morning. I say, are there any 2/3 of the popular support for this military increase? He said, there's no evidence for supporting that. But I'm not opposing to that. But I think that remains to be seen because that leads to some very controversial repercussion. Firstly, because where did they get the money for this defense budget?
We'll cover that later on.
Okay.
But I mean, the figures that I'm citing come from NHK and also from Reuters in terms of public polls that have been undertaken. If I can bring in Professor Guo there. So this is a big shift in terms of the public in Japan, or perhaps not? Do they back? Do you, from what you know, do they back this military buildup?
I think the general public in Japan, out of two major incidents, started to change the attitude. Number one is the 24th of February, the Ukraine war. Actually shocked the Japanese general public quite a lot. And secondly, it is the Chinese military drill in early August. So more than 50% of Japanese people support the increase of defense budget in Japan. But controversially, more than 66% of people oppose to any kind of tax increase
of course,
to support this increase in defense budget.
Professor, why don't we now move to the three defense documents? So in your view, how major are these changes?
Those three documents, including National Security Strategy, which will be the second version, and the seventh version of National Defense Program Guideline, and seventh version of this midterm defense program. And NSS, National Security Strategy, is more like overall guidelines for its diplomacy and defense policy. And the second one, NDPG, National Defense Program Guideline, is a 5-year defense policy platform. And this midterm defense program is for defense budgeting and for deployment, for procurement, weapon procurement.
So, Professor, the item, the big ticket item that people are picking out is the counter-strike capability.
Exactly.
Yeah, so for that they need to have long-range missiles.
Yes.
How significant is that?
The U.S. tend to restrict its allies and partners' missile capabilities before, but this year they lift the restriction because there's no more comparison to the Chinese naval capacity anymore, because China's navy is growing, has been growing at more than 3% per year, and allowing those countries to extend their missile range. So, for example, Type 12 anti-ship missile of Japan, the current range is less than 200 kilometers. But we are expecting Japan will deploy more than 1,000 Type 12 missile, which having range is more than 1,000 kilometers. So, in addition to that, I mean, there is a time gap between now and the actual deployment. So, the Japanese government plans to procure 500 Tomahawk cruise missiles, and the shooting range of Tomahawks is more than 500 kilometers. So you basically can hit, with that range, you can hit every single coastal city of China.
Okay,
Yeah.
and importantly, this is counterattack, so only if struck themselves.
Yes.
Let's talk about the first Joint Command Center and also Joint Command with the US. How significant is that?
The Japanese government is designing a joint commander under the Joint Chief of Staff. That's quite a unique design, but that design is particularly designed to have an interlink relation with the Indo-PACOM commander. Yeah. So in that way, they could, the two forces could easily or more with higher flexibility for integrated deployment during any kind of contingency.
Would that draw Japan into a Taiwan contingency more, that they would end up fighting alongside the US?
I mean, I think regardless of this defense decision-making reform, geographically, Japan basically cannot become irrelevant to any kind of Taiwan contingency at all, because those remote islands are just too close to Taiwan.
Yeah. Still to come in the show, Japan, Britain and Italy are merging their next-generation jet fighter projects in a groundbreaking partnership spanning Europe and Asia. But first, senior Japanese politician Koichi Hagiuda visited Taiwan in the first visit by a top member of Japan's ruling party in 19 years. The Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP, policy chief and a former industry minister met with President Tsai Ing-wen just ahead of the release of the 3 defense strategies. Let's hear what they both had to say.
台湾会持续跟日本 在安全等各领域深化合作的关系，一起促进印太区域的自由开放及稳定。
我が国は戦後一貫して平和国家としての道を歩んでまいりました。その歩みはこれからも決して変わるものではありません。しかし、ただ平和という言葉を唱えるだけで私たちの平和が守られるわけではありません。専守防衛という我が国防衛の基本原則はしっかりと堅持しながら、我が国を攻撃しようとしている相手に対しては、それはやめた方がいいと考えさせる、そうした十分な能力が我が方にあることを明確に示すことが重要です。
Ambassador, let me come to you first. So how significant was this visit by Hagiuda?
Well, I was told that this time, Hagiuda, Mr. Hagiuda's visit is for the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the Exchange Association between Taiwan and Japan. After the diplomatic the breakup 50 years ago. So it's rather for a ceremonial, okay, and for the this kind of a bilateral relations sake, visit. So and he was attending a seminar forum, and where he gave the VIP remarks and keynote speakers. So, but if we say that his visit will bring some important or very substantial message with regard to security or any cooperation.
Yeah, because they could have sent somebody more junior. I mean, in the past we've had the LDP youth.
But the 50th anniversary is a big anniversary. So I think they deserve some of the very important LDP officials visit. And I think Hagiuda is ranked number 3, if I understand correctly, within the LDP. So his visit is symbolic, and also it brings some very good signal for the bilateral relations between Japanese and Taiwanese. And for the security, the issue, of course, Taiwan shared their concern. But if I may be straightforward, I'm not very convinced that the military spending increase on the Japanese side will bring some very kind of positive information or news to Taiwanese in terms of safeguarding our defense against Chinese aggression. So, although Mr. Abe, he used to say that any emergency with Taiwan will be emergency of Japan. I think that remains to be seen, to be watched, because that might be immature, okay, to see that if something happened militarily in Taiwan, and then the Japanese will come to our rescue, will come to I would rather call on our fellow people to be very practical, because the Japanese, they want to their own interest, their security. They're not obligated to protect Taiwan's security interests. So we have to be mature about that.
I see. So, Professor, Ambassador is saying that simply because Japan increases its defense, builds up, this wouldn't have benefits to Taiwan.
Not directly. So we have to. We appreciate that. We appreciate that.
So,
but not so immaturely.
Okay.
Think that would help us.
So less of this, the talk of the allies, US-led allies, being a deterrent to China. What's your view on
that? Speaking of Hagiuda-san's visit to Taiwan this time, I think 3 major issues, which is linking to ambassadors just mentioned. Number 1 is, of course, for coordination for these 3 major security documents from Japan to Taiwan, which will bear very high linkage of security between the 2 countries. And number 2 is, of course, semiconductor. And number 3 is Taiwan's entry to CPTPP. And I will explain the first one. I will not say it is irrelevant to Japan at all if there is any Taiwan contingency. And I am not convinced either that Japan will actively to rescue Taiwan, to help Taiwan during any kind of contingency. But
if they are impacted, if their territory,
exactly,
if they are bombed.
Yeah, Japan basically no way for Japan to get away,
right.
Because geographically, Japan is too close to Taiwan, and secondly, as I just mentioned, this Futenma base and Kadena base of these states
Those very southern islands.
It's
closest.
very close.
Yeah.
It is actually, when we are talking about whether China will blockade Taiwan or not, I think it's a fact issue because the east coast of Taiwan, the air and waters, is actually not operated by Taiwanese Air Force or Navy, neither Japanese Air Force or Navy. It is actually the U.S. Air Force and U.S. Marines.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So if for China to blockade Taiwan from Taiwan's east coast, meaning the PLA will have first threat from Taiwan, the back threat from the U.S. forces. That's military unrealistic.
And also, it's not in Japan's interest for Taiwan to fall to China. I mean, in terms of
We have to,
shipping, in terms of the line of defense.
I think that we have to somehow categorize the certain area where in the case of the Chinese aggression, Chinese invasion, a certain area maybe Japan and Taiwan are bound to work with each other, to help each other in jointly defending Chinese aggression.
Yeah.
But in certain area, of course, we have to be practical. I think so because I like to remind people that this in any possible unfortunately Chinese aggression, the top concern, will be the Japanese people living and working or studying in Taiwan. That's what they're going to protect, not the Taiwanese people. We have to be clear about that. Now, secondly, of course, as Professor mentioned, that the semiconductor that combined Japan and Taiwan together, I think Taiwan has become the semiconductor, the kingdom of the chips. Not only Japan, but U.S. and some of European countries. They're sure about that. So we have to take the best advantage of our treasure.
Okay. I want to get on to how Japan might fund this military buildup. And there are some analysts that are saying that Kishida is walking a very tightrope here. What's your view on that, Professor?
I do not think so, because first of all, Prime Minister Kishida's popularity is already low enough. Right now it's around 24 to 30%, depending on which media poll. So it's low enough. It cannot get worse than that. And number two, the Japanese government debt problem is serious enough. It's more than 200% of its GDP, and the amount it is also the top in the world. Yeah, and the biggest problem of that is it is structural. It's annual. The Japanese government has to borrow $360 billion US for debt every year because of social welfare budgeting. So
are you saying that it's a drop in the ocean to fund this with more government borrowing?
The problem is almost like hopeless for Japan. And no matter it's Prime Minister Abe or the current Prime Minister, having no clear idea how to fix Japan's debt problem. So speaking of popularity and debt problem, there's no way out for Japan currently. Yeah.
So in terms of, we've just had the elections in Japan. So there's another few years until elections come up again. But maybe the LDP or Kishida himself will be in trouble at that time.
The last general election was last October 2021. So it is guaranteed in the coming 2.5 years, Japan will not have any major election. So which make Prime Minister Kishida quite free to push for the reforms in defense.
But higher taxes, in 3-4 years' time, will still be unpopular.
It is unpopular. More than 66% of the Japanese general public oppose it, especially when LDP is discussing to increase the corporate tax, tobacco tax, and also the revitalization tax. Adding up the three taxes, it will account for 1 trillion Japanese yen per year, but which is still, not enough for the gap from this defense budget increase.
Okay, so still to come, a takeover of Taiwan by force would be a Pyrrhic victory for China, i.e. one that would come at a cost greater than any gains. That's the conclusion of research by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, in Washington.
China would have to basically deal with a massive occupation that would be enormously expensive, relative to its economy, much more so than, say, the U.S. occupation of Iraq. And China would most likely be isolated diplomatically and economically from essentially the advanced economy.
Gerard DiPippo from CSIS in Washington. Now, the next generation fighter jet collaboration with Italy and the UK is Japan's first major industrial defense collaboration beyond the United States since World War II. The deal aims to put an advanced frontline fighter into operation by 2035 by combining the British-led Tempest program with Japan's FX program. Professor, how significant is this deal?
First of all, I will say the deal for the sixth generation fighter cooperation, UK, Japan, and Italy. The number one reason is actually coming out from this bitter experience of these indigenous F-2 fighters' background. Japan's cooperation with the States in 1985.
Right.
Yeah, it's a very bad experience.
So they deliberately moved away from the US because of...
yeah, that's number one. And number two is from Trump. Trump's trade pressure in 2018. So originally Japan planned to manufacture 100 units of F-35 fighter, but Prime Minister Abe kind of shifted to procure the whole plan directly from the States, which angered the Japanese defense industry a lot. And number three is...
what happened with the indigenous fighters in the 1980s?
In 1985. Yeah. That was originally Japan wanted to design its own indigenous fighter, yeah, but because of the trade deficit, it was so high between Japan and the States, and the U.S. government was putting pressure on Japan to make it a joint R&D program. And the joint is just in name. F-2 fighter of Japan is basically a copycat of the U.S. F-16 fighter. So that was a very bitter experience of Japanese defense industry development.
Ambassador?
I can echo somehow about this point because that's during my time in Washington, D.C. Okay, I worked in Washington. I recall vividly my talk with the Japanese embassy, I think the political counselor. God rest his soul, and turned out to be a good friend. Also, I talked with the U.S. State Department, the EAP Bureau official, about the U.S.-Japan relation. They're during the trade dispute between U.S. and Japan, 1980s. And I witnessed what happened. So I sensed that the Japanese embassy people, they feel a bit sense of discomfort with working with the U.S. in economically and politically, as well as the militarily. So I think I'm not surprised that the Japanese, they're always growing and developing under certain U.S. shadow, U.S. umbrella. So they like to get out of there as soon as much as they can.
So this is diversification, independence.
Yeah.
Professor, what are the implications for the UK and for Italy, briefly, for their ambitions, maybe in the Asia Pacific?
This joint project is actually very important for UK and Japan. UK and Japan signed its equipment cooperation agreement in 2013 under Prime Minister Abe's term. And the UK's BAE, Rolls-Royce, and the Italian Leonard, SPA, along together with Japanese Mitsubishi Heavy Industry together, they could share a lot of their own cutting-edge technology together, and for example, like AI, unmanned control technology, and also this integrate missile system in the sixth generation fighter, and very high possibility this will be the first unmanned fighter for the three countries.
Right. So what does the UK and Italy get out of this?
For example, the Japanese MHI, Mitsubishi Heavy Industry, is very well known at massive production at high quality of defense equipment. So for UK and Italy to get from Japan is this mass production technology from Japan and from MHI.
Now, when it comes to any invasion of Taiwan by the PRC, there are plenty of studies looking at what could lead to a crisis. and how war over Taiwan might occur in terms of military details. But there's little on the economic, political and diplomatic costs that China may incur. Gerard De Pippo is a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, in Washington, D.C. And in our extended interview, he explained to me why he believes the cost to the Chinese Communist Party of any invasion would not be worth the undertaking. Let's take a look. Gerard, recently the Pentagon released 4 possible scenarios of how China might take Taiwan. Now, in your study, you argue that we should actually highlight the economic and diplomatic costs. Why do you think there has been so much emphasis on the military, and what are the pitfalls of doing this?
There is a fair amount of research on how a war over Taiwan might occur in terms of military details, but there's actually very little on the economic, political, and diplomatic aspects. There's also very little on sort of the longer term implications. So looking beyond the war itself and looking instead at what the world might look like after a war. Why are those things not covered? I would speculate that part of it is it's, I mean, frankly, just too speculative for most academics to undertake. But there actually aren't that many economists focused specifically in national security issues. But there are a lot of people that look at the pure security side of things. So I think the net effect of it is that you just end up getting analysis that's much more biased towards the military aspects and overlook those other important factors.
Recently, the Financial Times had a story where they talked about the US releasing research from the Rhodium Group, and it came to the figure of $2.5 trillion of damage to the global economy. I see that you come to a similar figure of $2.6 trillion in terms of the economic costs, but I think that you said this is not the full picture. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's not even remotely the full economic picture. The $2.6 trillion refers to just the current value added of trade basically going through China that might be disrupted. Modeling these kinds of shocks is very difficult. Rhodium ran into the same problem. I mean, the basic reason is if you look at the way economic models and these types of cost estimates normally work, therefore events that are sort of within the historical record. What we're talking about here would be without parallel, at least in modern history, be closer to basically World War II. And so this is something that's just sort of beyond the models. And so I would not put any confidence in any $1 figure other than to say it would be massive, certainly in the trillions. If there's actually a war over Taiwan, particularly if that war involves the United States and China fighting each other, it would be massively disruptive to the global economy. At a minimum, global commercial shipping would be disrupted. It's likely that a lot of commercial shipping companies would not want to go into many of the 6 or 7 major ports on the Chinese side that would see most likely be within the battle zone. You would have massive financial effects. It would rattle financial markets. The Chinese currency would tank. All commodity markets would move, etc. I think the more specific side of it would be because of the importance of both Taiwan as an exporter of semiconductors and China as essentially the world's factory, which absorbs a lot of those Taiwanese semiconductors. You would have a lot of global trade coming to a standstill because China is so important for global supply chains. And it would be particularly obvious for things like electronics. You would find things like laptops or cell phones or whatever would be in very short supply. You would see very high inflation on certain goods and also massive shortages. So again, I can't put a dollar figure on that, but it would be far beyond what we've seen in, say, the Russia-Ukraine war, and probably beyond what we saw in the global financial crisis in 2008.
I mean, given that the world has only really seen World War II, and obviously that's sort of receding a little bit in terms of, being 70 years ago, but now we have the Russia war. I mean, are there any analogies that we can draw? I mean, can we say, that it would be, order of 5 or 6 of the damage that we've seen so far in Russia? And also maybe what you mentioned in terms of nobody's really looked at the long-term, I guess, isolation that China would experience. Is there any comparisons that we could draw with Putin and Russia?
Well, I mean, looking back further into history, I think actually the closest analogy, even though it's quite loose, would be the First World War, because that basically put an end to what was called the first age of globalization, when supply chains were connected not quite as much as they are now, but there was much more trade, and you had basically the world's largest economies fighting each other. Comparing, say, the current Russian-Ukraine war, that's quite different for several reasons. One, of course, the Chinese economy is much larger. It's much more important in terms of manufacturing. Russia is actually just a commodities exporter, more or less. The battle zone in the Russia-Ukraine war has not interrupted that much trade. Russia can still export things via pipelines and through its northern ports. If there's actually a war over Taiwan, it's actually going to choke off a major artery of global commerce, and it would affect China's exports as well. I think other differences are that if you assume, as we do, I think realistically, that there's at least a good chance that the United States would be involved in that war, which of course the United States is not directly involved in the war against Russia. I think the global response would be enormous. What we're suggesting actually is that because of U.S. involvement, and especially under a scenario where the U.S. is essentially taking maybe thousands of casualties in combat, we would expect the American public and political class to react rather violently. And I actually think that the U.S. would basically bring its full economic and political means to bear, including on getting allies to get in line with any basically economic sanctions regime against China. I mean, people will sometimes suggest that because China is so important economically, it's just unconscionable that countries would align against it economically. I think before a conflict, that's maybe credible, that the threshold for doing severe sanctions would be much higher. But I think once a shooting starts, I would not bank on much restraint in that regard. Economic logic has been trumped time and time again by nationalism, so it would just be massively disruptive in a way that would be far beyond what we've seen with the Russia conflict.
Help us to paint the picture of what a post-invasion world would look like in terms of de-globalization.
We're actually assuming, in part just to sort of speculate, that China prevails, that they essentially occupy Taiwan. So you would have a world where China, quote, won the war in a sort of direct military sense. But the Taiwanese economy would be shattered. China would have to basically deal with a massive occupation that would be enormously expensive, relative to its economy, much more so than, say, the U.S. occupation of Iraq. And China would most likely be isolated diplomatically and economically from essentially the advanced economy, so more or less the G7. We assume that a lot of developing countries or emerging markets would more or less be neutral, and there would still be, free flow of commodities with China afterwards. But I think if you look at the behavior of multinational companies, even this year in the real world, in response to the Ukraine war and cross-strait tensions, I think a lot of companies would rather rapidly have to reassess their exposures to China. And we think that companies that are basically in the Chinese market for purposes of exporting would consider China to no longer be reliable, in part because the United States would probably still have sanctions on China. For companies that are in China for the Chinese market, they would no longer expect that China would be the world's growth market. I think if you're realistic about the political implications for China, we think China would probably, under wartime conditions or post-wartime conditions, would be far more repressive. It would be highly unlikely to enact, let's say, liberalizing economic reforms. It would be in the other direction. So it would probably, after the initial massive shock, be more or less stagnant. And I think companies would factor it in. So basically, you'd have China that is, potentially trapped in the middle income trap, so to speak, and has lost a whole lot of foreign investment and is more or less going alone, with really only robust trading relationships with developing countries and emerging markets. But of course, China's main export markets are actually the advanced economies that would be aligned against it.
Yeah, and you mentioned the fact that an invasion of Taiwan would preclude any sort of the 2049 goal of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So do you think it's actually a choice that the CCP has to make?
It's quite clear in the real world that the Chinese leadership prefers peaceful, quote, reunification with Taiwan. That may not be possible. In the event of actual forceful reunification, there would clearly be a massive contradiction between these two goals of national rejuvenation. One, of course, being reunification with Taiwan, the other being basically achieving socialist modernization, or really just becoming a rich, advanced economy. I actually do think that those are basically an either or. I do not believe that a China that is isolated economically and diplomatically would be able to develop. I mean, it might technically be a high income country in a sort of low end part of that band, But it's just hard to imagine China achieving much growth going forward. And if you'd, I think realistically could imagine that under a conflict scenario where China say cut off from the global dollar network, China could easily have a massive financial crisis. There could be crises other way or in other places, by the way. But in China's case, I think they would just be in terrible shape fiscally and financially. And so they basically would not be able to achieve all of those national rejuvenation goals.
In our final extended interview today, I discuss with Kit Liao, an assistant director at Atlantic Council's Global Hub, whether this case points to broader divisions in Taiwan's military and how Taiwanese can arm themselves against Beijing's propaganda. Kitch has extensive military and defense experience both in the US Department of Defense, Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and Taiwan's Institute of National Defense and Security Research. Let's take a look. Why is it that Taiwan is at this incredible disadvantage, unable to have joint military exercises, say, with Japan?
Having joint exercises is pretty much the privilege of basically, a sovereign entity that's considered to be a country. Open exercises becomes a political impossibility. That doesn't mean there's no exercises, though. Like as Global Times, the famed party paper by the Chinese, actually talked about last year, they were able to spot joint Coast Guard exercise between Japan, Taiwan, and the US in Palau. And there has been rumors and reports and actually photographic evidence that the US Marine Special Operations Command actually sent people to Taiwan for joint exercises. Now, these small scale, like working level exercises, I basically see them as a way to signal to China that there is intention, there's credibility, and there's capability behind the US deterrence posture in terms of defending Taiwan.
Moving to Japan, obviously a US treaty ally as well as, friendly towards Taiwan. They are about to release the National Defense Strategy and are expected to name China as a challenge. How do you think this might play into sort of allies being drawn together to counter the threat of China in terms of a Taiwan invasion?
Japan suffers from the same problem as everybody else, right? They can't recognize Taiwan as a country. They cannot have formal relations with the Taiwanese military. But what I'm proposing is that anything that can be done needs to go through the U.S. because, of course, U.S.-Japan is a treaty ally, and if the U.S. were to be serious and establishing any sort of contingency plans involving Taiwan, it behooves Japan to actually think about what role they might play. There are basic procedures such as communication protocols, what sort of communication abbreviation terms that each other uses, what sort of channels we regularly uses. This kind of working